Imagine standing on the banks of a raging river in the darkness of night, the sound of approaching enemy forces growing louder with each passing moment. Your army has massive steel tanks weighing dozens of tons, artillery pieces that could level buildings, and thousands of soldiers ready to fight. But there is one problem that could destroy everything. The bridge ahead lies in ruins, blown apart by retreating enemies who knew that water would become their greatest ally. For centuries, armies had faced this exact nightmare, watching helplessly as rivers became impossible barriers that turned victories into defeats and turned confident advances into desperate retreats. Soldiers would spend days or even weeks trying to cross a single waterway, giving their enemies precious time to regroup, reinforce, and prepare devastating counterattacks. But in the midst of World War II, one remarkable invention changed warfare forever and solved a problem that had plagued military commanders since ancient times. This is the story of the Bailey Bridge, a portable bridge system so revolutionary that it allowed tanks to cross rivers in just hours instead of weeks, and it became one of the most important yet least celebrated inventions of the entire war. It saved countless lives, decided the outcomes of major battles, and proved that sometimes the greatest weapons are not the ones that destroy but the ones that build. Throughout human history, rivers have been both lifelines and obstacles for armies trying to conquer territory and defend their homelands. Ancient Roman legions faced this challenge constantly as they expanded their empire across Europe, often finding their powerful military machines stopped cold by water that their soldiers could not cross safely. Generals like Julius Caesar spent enormous amounts of time and resources building temporary bridges from wood and rope, but these structures took weeks to construct and could be destroyed easily by enemies or swept away by flooding. The problem became even worse as warfare advanced and armies grew larger, because a wooden bridge that might hold a few hundred-foot soldiers would collapse instantly under the weight of heavy artillery or armored vehicles. During the First World War, military planners watched in frustration as entire offensives ground to a halt at river crossings, with engineers struggling to build bridges while under constant enemy fire. Thousands of soldiers died trying to cross rivers on flimsy pontoon bridges or makeshift rafts that capsized in strong currents, and generals knew that whoever could solve the river crossing problem would gain an enormous advantage in future conflicts. The challenge was not just about building something strong, but building something that could be transported easily, assembled quickly, and adapted to different situations without requiring months of planning or specialized equipment that might not be available in the chaos of battle. Donald Bailey was not a warrior or a famous general whose name appeared in newspapers and history books. He was a quiet, thoughtful civil engineer working for the British government, spending his days designing ordinary structures and solving practical problems that most people never thought about. Born in 1901 in the town of Rotherham in England, Bailey grew up during a time when the world was changing rapidly with new technologies and new ways of thinking about construction. He studied engineering with a careful, methodical mind that loved taking complex problems and finding elegant solutions that worked reliably even under difficult conditions. When World War II began in 1939, Bailey was working at the Military Engineering Experimental Establishment, a government facility where engineers developed new equipment and systems for the British Army. The military desperately needed better ways to cross rivers and repair damaged bridges, because early campaigns had shown that existing methods were far too slow and dangerous. Bailey began thinking about this problem with the same careful attention he applied to everything, but instead of just improving old designs, he decided to completely reimagine what a military bridge could be. He understood that the bridge needed to be made from pieces small enough that soldiers could carry them without heavy machinery, strong enough to support tanks weighing many tons, simple enough that troops could assemble it without extensive training, and flexible enough to span different distances and handle various terrain conditions. Working quietly in his office and workshop, Bailey began sketching ideas that would transform military engineering forever. His breakthrough came from a deceptively simple concept that other engineers had overlooked for decades. Instead of trying to build one massive, strong structure, Bailey designed a system of identical panels that could be connected together like building blocks to create bridges of any length or strength needed. Each panel was made of steel and measured 10 feet long and 5 feet high, with a distinctive lattice framework that distributed weight efficiently, while keeping each panel light enough for 6 soldiers to carry. The genius of the design was in how these panels connected to each other using pins and clamps that required no welding, no bolts, and no specialized tools that might be lost or unavailable in combat situations. Bailey also realized that the bridge could be made stronger simply by adding more layers of panels side by side or stacking them vertically, which meant the same basic components could create a bridge for light vehicles or one strong enough for the heaviest tanks. He worked through countless calculations, testing his ideas on paper before building small prototypes that he examined from every angle, always looking for weaknesses or ways to make the design even simpler. By 1940, Bailey had developed a complete system that included not just the panels, but also the transom beams that formed the bridge deck, the steel stringers that ran lengthwise to support traffic, and the ramps and anchoring systems that connected the bridge to the riverbanks on each side. When Bailey first presented his design to military officials, many were skeptical that such a simple system could actually work under real combat conditions. The British Army had tried numerous bridge designs over the years, and most had failed in various ways, either breaking under heavy loads, taking too long to assemble, or proving too complicated for soldiers to use correctly in stressful situations. Bailey knew he needed to prove his bridge worked beyond any doubt, so he arranged for a full-scale demonstration that would test every aspect of the design. Engineers built a Bailey bridge over a testing ground, and then drove tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces across it, while military observers watched carefully for any signs of weakness or failure. The bridge performed flawlessly, supporting loads far heavier than required without bending or showing stress, and the observers were amazed to discover that a team of soldiers could assemble a bridge section in just a few hours using only basic hand tools. Even more impressive was watching engineers extend the bridge by adding more panels, or strengthen it by connecting additional layers, all while the structure remained stable and safe. The British military immediately recognized that Bailey had created something extraordinary, and they ordered the bridge system into production as quickly as possible, understanding that this invention could give Allied forces a crucial advantage as the war intensified across Europe and North Africa. As factories began manufacturing Bailey Bridge components in 1941, the war situation grew increasingly desperate for Allied forces fighting on multiple fronts. German armies had conquered most of Europe with lightning-fast attacks that overwhelmed defenders before they could establish strong defensive positions, and one of the German advantages was their excellent engineering units that could build temporary bridges relatively quickly. The Allies needed every possible advantage to slow down enemy advances and support their own counteroffensives, which meant getting Bailey bridges to combat zones became an urgent priority. British factories worked around the clock producing the steel panels, with workers understanding that each bridge component they manufactured might save hundreds or thousands of lives on distant battlefields. The panels were designed to be stackable and transportable, which meant they could be loaded onto trucks, trains, or even ships without requiring special containers or handling equipment. Military planners began stockpiling bridge components at supply depots across England, preparing for the day when Allied armies would return to Europe and need to cross hundreds of destroyed bridges and rivers. Engineers received training on how to assemble Bailey bridges quickly, learning the specific sequences and techniques that Bailey himself had developed through his careful testing. The training emphasized speed and efficiency because, in combat situations, Every minute spent building a bridge was a minute when soldiers were exposed to enemy fire, and when advancing armies lost valuable momentum that might never be recovered. The Bailey Bridge received its first real combat test in the brutal North African campaign, where British and Commonwealth forces fought against German and Italian armies across vast deserts and rocky mountains. In this harsh landscape, rivers might be dry most of the year but could suddenly flood with violent water during rare rainstorms, and the few permanent bridges became key strategic points that both sides fought to control. When Allied engineers arrived at destroyed bridges or difficult crossings, they unpacked Bailey Bridge components and began assembly under conditions that tested both the equipment and the men. Desert heat made the steel panels burning hot to touch, sandstorms reduced visibility to almost nothing, and enemy artillery constantly threatened the bridge building sites. Despite these challenges, the Bailey Bridge proved its worth again and again, with engineering units completing river crossings that would have been impossible with older bridge systems. Tanks that might have been stuck for weeks waiting for conventional bridges to be built instead rolled across Bailey bridges within hours of arriving at obstacles. The German forces quickly realized that the Allies had gained a significant advantage, because every time they destroyed a bridge to slow the Allied advance, British engineers simply built a Bailey Bridge and kept the offensive moving forward. Stories began spreading among Allied soldiers about these miraculous bridges that appeared almost overnight, and the bridges became symbols of British engineering skill and determination that boosted morale during difficult campaigns. When Allied forces invaded Italy in 1943, they encountered terrain that was a nightmare for military engineers trying to support advancing armies. The Italian landscape featured countless rivers, steep valleys, and mountain passes, where a single destroyed bridge could halt an entire division for days or weeks. German defenders understood this advantage perfectly and systematically destroyed every bridge as they retreated northward, turning Italy into a country where water and chasms became more dangerous than enemy soldiers. Bailey bridges became absolutely essential to the Italian campaign, with engineering units working non-stop to span rivers, gorges, and bomb craters that blocked the advance. In one remarkable achievement, engineers built a Bailey Bridge across the Sangro River while under heavy enemy fire, completing the structure in just 24 hours despite losing several men to German artillery. The bridge allowed British tanks to cross and continue pursuing retreating German forces, preventing the enemy from establishing a strong defensive line that might have prolonged the Italian campaign by months. As Allied armies pushed northward through Italy, they left behind a trail of Bailey bridges that kept supply lines open and allowed reinforcements to reach the front lines. Some of these bridges spanned distances of over 200 feet, requiring innovative engineering to support the long spans while maintaining enough strength to carry heavy traffic. Engineers learned to adapt the Bailey system to unique situations, sometimes building bridges at steep angles to cross ravines, or creating multi-lane bridges by placing two Bailey structures side by side to handle the enormous traffic volumes of modern mechanized armies. As Allied commanders planned the invasion of France that would become known as D-Day, they knew that river crossings would be one of their greatest challenges once armies broke out from the Normandy beaches. France had hundreds of rivers and streams that crisscrossed the countryside, and German forces would certainly destroy every bridge to slow the Allied advance toward Germany. Military planners calculated that the invasion would require hundreds of Bailey bridges, perhaps more than had been used in all previous campaigns combined, and they began assembling massive stockpiles of bridge components in England. Special engineering brigades trained specifically for rapid bridge construction, practicing their techniques until they could assemble Bailey bridges with almost assembly line efficiency. The planners also developed special waterproof packaging for bridge components that would be landed on the invasion beaches, because the panels and beams needed to survive exposure to salt water and rough handling during the chaotic first days of the invasion. Donald Bailey himself worked with military engineers to develop new variations of his bridge design that could handle specific challenges expected in France, including extra long spans and reinforced versions that could support the newest heavy tanks that weighed far more than anything the bridge had originally been designed to carry. The preparations were enormous and involved thousands of workers producing bridge components, but Allied commanders considered every bit of effort worthwhile because they understood that the success or failure of the entire invasion might depend on how quickly their armies could cross French rivers and maintain momentum driving toward Germany. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, engineering units landed alongside combat troops with Bailey Bridge components packed in waterproof containers. The first bridges were needed almost immediately as armies pushed inland from the beaches and encountered streams, canals, and destroyed road bridges that German defenders had demolished before retreating. Engineers worked frantically to assemble Bailey bridges while battles raged around them, often completing bridges even as enemy snipers targeted them from hidden positions. One of the most critical early bridges was built across the Orne Canal, allowing British tanks to advance toward the city of Caen much faster than German commanders had expected. As more Allied divisions poured into France, the demand for bridges became overwhelming, with engineering units building multiple Bailey bridges every single day to keep the advance moving. The bridges varied enormously in size and configuration, from small spans over country streams that took just a few hours to build, to massive structures over major rivers that required days of work and hundreds of panels. In the town of Grey-sur-Mer, engineers built a Bailey bridge to replace a destroyed stone bridge, and the structure handled so much military traffic that it became one of the most heavily used supply routes in the entire invasion. The reliability of Bailey bridges meant that Allied commanders could plan offensive operations with confidence, knowing that their engineers could bridge almost any obstacle within hours rather than the weeks that conventional bridge building would require. After the initial landings, Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began a rapid advance across France that caught German forces by surprise and liberated vast territories in just weeks. This lightning advance was only possible because Bailey bridges kept supply lines open and allowed tanks and trucks to maintain their momentum, even when every permanent bridge had been destroyed. Engineering units became experts at rapidly assessing river crossing sites, calculating exactly how many Bailey bridge panels would be needed, and organizing construction efforts that resembled well-choreographed dances of steel and determination. At the Seine River, multiple Bailey bridges were built simultaneously at different crossing points, allowing entire divisions to cross quickly instead of bottlenecking at single locations. The bridges were so reliable that military police often had to control traffic to prevent too many vehicles from trying to cross at once, because the roads leading to the bridges became more congested than the bridges themselves. German forces attempted to destroy Bailey bridges through artillery bombardment and air attacks, but they discovered that the bridges were remarkably resilient and could often be repaired quickly even after taking damage. In several instances, bridges that were partially destroyed by German fire were rebuilt and back in service within just a few hours, frustrating enemy commanders who had hoped that destroying bridges would buy them time to establish new defensive positions. French civilians watched in amazement as British and American engineers built bridges that seemed to rise from nothing, and many communities that had lived for years without bridges found themselves reconnected to the outside world, thanks to Bailey structures that remained in place even after the war ended. The Bailey Bridge faced one of its greatest challenges during Operation Market Garden, the ambitious Allied attempt to capture bridges across the Netherlands and open a direct route into Germany. This operation required engineering units to support airborne troops who were dropped behind enemy lines to capture key bridges, while ground forces raced northward to link up with the paratroopers. Bailey bridges became absolutely critical to this plan, because the route northward crossed multiple rivers and canals, and every minute of delay gave German forces more time to organize counterattacks. Engineers built Bailey bridges under intense pressure, knowing that paratroopers were fighting desperately to hold captured bridges and waiting for relief that depended entirely on whether the ground advance could maintain its schedule. One Bailey Bridge was built across the Wilhelmina Canal after German forces destroyed the original bridge, and this crossing allowed British tanks to continue northward toward the besieged paratroopers at Arnhem. Despite the heroic efforts of engineering units who built bridges faster than ever before, Operation Market Garden ultimately failed because the advance could not reach Arnhem in time. But the Bailey bridges performed exactly as designed and proved that even in the most difficult circumstances, Donald Bailey's invention could be counted on to deliver results. The operation demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of military engineering, because while bridges could be built quickly, they could not overcome fundamental strategic problems or compensate for inadequate planning in other areas. The Rhine River represented the final major obstacle between Allied armies and the heart of Germany, and German defenders were determined to make crossing the Rhine as costly as possible for the Allies. When American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945, they gained a precious foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine, but the damaged bridge was barely strong enough to support traffic and could collapse at any moment. Engineers immediately began building a Bailey Bridge right next to the damaged railroad bridge, working around the clock because they knew that thousands of soldiers depended on getting reinforcements and supplies across the river. The Bailey Bridge was completed in just days, and when the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed from accumulated damage, the Bailey Bridge immediately became the primary crossing point and continued carrying traffic without interruption. At other locations along the Rhine, Allied engineers built Bailey bridges after initial assault troops established bridgeheads on the eastern bank, and these bridges allowed the full weight of Allied armies to cross the river and begin the final drive into Germany. The Rhine crossings represented the culmination of years of bridge-building experience, with engineering units displaying incredible skill and efficiency that would have been impossible without the Bailey Bridge system. Bridges that might have taken months to build using conventional methods were instead completed in days, allowing Allied armies to maintain relentless pressure on German forces who could no longer use rivers as defensive barriers. While the Bailey Bridge became famous in Europe, the invention also played crucial roles in other theaters of World War II, where terrain and destroyed infrastructure created similar challenges. In Burma, British and Indian forces fighting against Japanese armies encountered dense jungles, monsoon rains, and rivers that could change from gentle streams to raging torrents overnight. Bailey bridges proved invaluable in this environment because they could be assembled even in remote jungle locations where conventional construction equipment could never reach. Engineering units carried bridge components through jungle paths on the backs of mules or even human porters when no other transport was available, then assembled bridges that allowed supplies and reinforcements to reach frontline troops fighting in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The bridges withstood tropical conditions that would have destroyed wooden structures within weeks, and many remained in service long after the war ended, becoming permanent infrastructure for communities that had never had reliable bridges before. In the Pacific Island campaigns, Bailey bridges helped American forces move quickly across islands where Japanese defenders had destroyed roads and bridges during their retreats. The modular nature of the Bailey system meant that bridge components could be loaded onto landing craft and brought ashore during amphibious assaults, ready to be assembled as soon as engineers secured the landing areas. These bridges were often relatively small compared to the massive structures built in Europe, but they were equally important for maintaining offensive momentum and preventing Japanese forces from using terrain to their advantage. Behind every Bailey bridge stood engineering units who faced dangers that were different from, but just as real as the threats faced by infantry soldiers in combat. Building bridges meant working in exposed positions where enemy artillery, mortar fire, and snipers could target engineers who had little protection while they struggled to connect panels and secure pins. Many engineers were killed or wounded while building bridges, and their names rarely appeared in headlines, even though their work was absolutely essential to Allied victory. The men who built Bailey bridges worked in all weather conditions, from the burning heat of North African deserts to the freezing cold of Northern European winters, and they maintained a level of professionalism and dedication that earned respect from combat troops who depended on their skills. Engineering units developed strong bonds of camaraderie because they understood that every member of the team was essential to completing bridges safely and quickly. When one engineer was wounded, others immediately took his place, and construction continued even under the most difficult circumstances. The psychological stress was enormous because engineers knew that delays in bridge building could cost the lives of soldiers waiting to cross rivers or waiting for supplies that could not reach them without functioning bridges. Despite these pressures, engineering units maintained remarkably high morale, taking pride in their ability to solve problems that seemed impossible and to build structures that directly contributed to winning the war. As the war progressed and the importance of Bailey bridges became undeniable, military leaders began publicly praising the invention and the man behind it. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, one of Britain's most famous generals, called the Bailey Bridge one of the three most important technological developments of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, wrote that the Bailey Bridge was crucial to Allied victory, and that without it, campaigns in Italy, France, and Germany would have been far more difficult and costly. These endorsements from top military leaders brought attention to Donald Bailey, who remained characteristically modest about his achievement, and insisted that credit belonged equally to the engineers who built the bridges and the factory workers who manufactured the components. Bailey received numerous honors, including being made an officer of the Order of the British Empire, but he never sought fame or fortune from his invention. He continued working as a civil engineer after the war, applying the same careful, methodical approach to peacetime problems that he had used to create his revolutionary bridge. The recognition also highlighted how important engineering and logistics were to modern warfare, because even the most powerful armies could not succeed without the ability to move quickly across difficult terrain and maintain supply lines that stretched for hundreds or thousands of miles. The scale of Bailey Bridge production and use during World War II was staggering and revealed just how completely the invention had been integrated into Allied military operations. British factories produced enough Bailey Bridge components during the war years to build over 600 miles of bridges if all the panels were laid end to end. Engineering units built thousands of individual Bailey bridges across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, ranging from small structures just a few panels long to massive bridges spanning hundreds of feet across major rivers. The bridges carried millions of vehicles, including thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of trucks, and countless artillery pieces that would otherwise have been stranded on the wrong side of rivers and unable to support advancing troops. In terms of lives saved, the impact was impossible to calculate precisely, but military historians agreed that Bailey bridges prevented countless casualties by allowing armies to maintain momentum and avoid prolonged sieges where soldiers would have been exposed to enemy fire for extended periods. The economic impact was equally significant because building permanent bridges would have required massive amounts of steel, concrete, and labor that were desperately needed for other war production. While Bailey bridges used relatively modest amounts of materials and could be assembled by ordinary soldiers without specialized construction equipment. After the war, many Bailey bridges remained in place for years or even decades, serving civilian populations who had lost their original bridges to wartime destruction and providing infrastructure that helped communities rebuild and recover. The basic Bailey Bridge design proved so versatile that engineers continued finding new ways to adapt and improve the system throughout the war and beyond. The original design could handle tanks up to 40 tons, but as heavier tanks entered service, modified Bailey bridges were developed with triple and even quadruple layers of panels that could support loads exceeding 70 tons. Engineers also created specialized versions for unique situations, including bridges with extra-wide decks that could handle 2 lanes of traffic simultaneously, and suspension variations that used cables to extend spans beyond what the standard panel system could achieve. In some cases, Bailey bridges were combined with pontoon systems to create floating bridges that could cross very wide rivers where building traditional bridge supports would have been impractical or impossible. The modular nature of the design meant that innovations developed for one specific situation could be quickly adopted and used elsewhere, creating a constantly evolving system that adapted to changing military needs. Military engineers from different allied nations shared their experiences and techniques, leading to improvements in assembly methods, anchoring systems, and traffic control procedures that made bridge building faster and safer. This collaborative approach to engineering innovation was itself significant because it demonstrated how sharing knowledge and working together could multiply the effectiveness of technology and create solutions that no single nation could have developed alone. When World War II ended in 1945, the Bailey Bridge did not retire, but instead began a second career that continues to this day. Military forces around the world adopted variations of the Bailey Bridge system, recognizing that the fundamental design remained as relevant as ever for armies needing to cross rivers and obstacles quickly. The United States developed the medium girder bridge, which used Bailey's basic concepts but incorporated American manufacturing standards and slightly different dimensions. Other nations created their own versions, each adapted to local needs, but all owing their existence to Donald Bailey's original breakthrough. Modern military bridges still use modular panel systems that can be connected without welding or specialized tools, and they still emphasize simplicity and speed of construction, because the basic challenges of military engineering have not changed despite advances in other technologies. The Bailey Bridge proved that sometimes a simple, elegant solution is superior to complex high-tech alternatives, and this lesson influenced military engineering philosophy for generations. Even today, armies training for combat operations practice building Bailey-style bridges, and engineers study the design principles that made the original bridge so successful. The bridge has also been used extensively in disaster relief operations, where the ability to quickly restore transportation links across damaged infrastructure can save lives and speed recovery efforts in the aftermath of earthquakes, floods, and other catastrophes. Beyond military use, Bailey bridges found widespread civilian applications that Donald Bailey could never have imagined when he first sketched his designs. In the years immediately following World War II, thousands of Bailey bridges were declared surplus by military forces and sold to civilian governments who needed temporary bridges while rebuilding permanent infrastructure destroyed during the war. Many of these temporary installations became semi-permanent or even permanent fixtures because the bridges worked so well that communities saw no reason to replace them with expensive new structures. Remote regions in developing countries discovered that Bailey bridges offered an affordable way to connect isolated villages to road networks, bringing economic development and improved access to healthcare and education. Mining companies used Bailey bridges to create temporary access roads to mineral deposits in mountainous terrain where building conventional bridges would have been prohibitively expensive. Construction companies employed Bailey bridges as temporary crossings while building permanent bridges, allowing traffic to continue flowing and avoiding the economic disruption that would result from completely closing roads during construction. The bridges appeared in locations ranging from rural areas of Africa and Asia to sophisticated infrastructure projects in wealthy nations, demonstrating the universal applicability of Bailey's design principles. Some civilian Bailey bridges have remained in service for decades, far longer than originally intended, because they continue functioning reliably despite age and heavy use. This longevity surprised even engineers who understood the strength of the design, and it confirmed that Bailey had created something truly exceptional that transcended its original military purpose. The success of the Bailey Bridge rested on engineering principles that remain fundamental to good design in any field. Bailey understood that complexity is often the enemy of reliability, and he deliberately created a system that was as simple as possible while still meeting all necessary requirements. Each component served clear purposes, and there were no unnecessary parts that could fail or create confusion during assembly. The standardization of components meant that manufacturing was efficient and replacement parts were always interchangeable, eliminating the problems that plagued earlier bridge systems, where each bridge was essentially unique and required custom components. The modular approach allowed the same basic system to be scaled up or down depending on needs, which meant armies only needed to train soldiers on one bridge system instead of multiple different designs for different situations. Bailey also recognized the importance of human factors in engineering design, understanding that equipment used by soldiers in combat needed to be intuitive and forgiving of mistakes, because users would be exhausted, stressed, and working under dangerous conditions. The pins and clamps that connected panels were designed so they could only be installed correctly, preventing assembly errors that might weaken the structure. These same design principles influenced countless other engineering projects in fields ranging from construction to aerospace, and Bailey's work is still studied in engineering schools as an example of how to approach complex problems with clarity and purpose. Donald Bailey lived a long life, but never sought the spotlight or traded on his fame as the inventor of one of World War II's most important innovations. After the war, he returned to quiet civilian engineering work, contributing to various infrastructure projects in Britain with the same careful attention to detail that characterized his bridge design. He occasionally gave lectures about the development of the Bailey Bridge, but he remained modest and always emphasized that many people contributed to making the bridge system successful. Bailey received honors from engineering societies and military organizations around the world, but these accolades never changed his fundamental personality or made him seek attention. He understood that his greatest achievement was not personal glory, but the knowledge that his invention had saved lives and helped defeat tyranny during humanity's darkest hour. When Bailey died in 1985 at the age of 83, obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world, but the coverage was modest compared to the enormous impact his invention had made on history. Many people who benefited from Bailey bridges during the war or used civilian versions in peacetime never knew the name of the engineer who created the system. But this anonymity would likely have pleased Bailey himself, who believed that good engineering should work so reliably that people take it for granted. His legacy is measured not in monuments or statues, but in the thousands of bridges that still carry traffic decades after his death, and in the military engineering principles that continue guiding how armies approach the challenge of mobility in combat. The story of the Bailey Bridge offers lessons that extend far beyond military history or engineering education. Bailey succeeded because he approached a problem that others considered unsolvable and refused to accept that existing methods were good enough. He combined technical knowledge with creative thinking, understanding that innovation often comes from questioning assumptions and imagining entirely new approaches rather than just improving old designs. The bridge also demonstrates how timing and context matter enormously in determining whether innovations succeed or fail. Because similar modular bridge concepts had been proposed before Bailey, but never gained acceptance because the military needs were not urgent enough to overcome institutional resistance to change. World War II created circumstances where old methods clearly were not working, which gave Bailey's revolutionary design the opportunity to prove itself. The rapid adoption and massive production of Bailey bridges showed that when organizations face existential challenges, they can move with remarkable speed to embrace innovations that might have been ignored during peacetime. The story also illustrates the importance of practical testing and demonstration, because Bailey's careful work to prove his bridge functioned as promised was essential to convincing skeptical military officials to take a chance on an unproven system. For modern innovators facing resistance to new ideas, the Bailey Bridge story suggests that combining solid technical work with clear demonstrations of value can overcome institutional inertia and create opportunities for transformative change. The Bailey Bridge stands as one of World War II's most remarkable yet underappreciated achievements, an invention that changed military history and saved countless lives through the power of simple, elegant engineering. Donald Bailey's creation allowed Allied armies to cross rivers in hours instead of weeks, maintaining offensive momentum that prevented enemy forces from regaining their balance and establishing strong defensive positions. The bridges carried the tanks and trucks that liberated Europe from Nazi occupation, supported troops fighting in jungles and deserts around the world, and provided infrastructure that helped civilian populations survive and rebuild during the war's darkest years. Beyond its immediate military impact, the Bailey Bridge influenced engineering thinking for generations and demonstrated that solving fundamental problems often requires not more complexity but more clarity of thought and purpose. The bridges that still stand decades after their construction testify to the quality of Bailey's design and the skill of the engineers and factory workers who brought his vision to reality. In an age that often celebrates flashy technology and dramatic innovations, the Bailey Bridge reminds us that the most important breakthroughs sometimes come quietly from careful thinkers who focus on solving real problems rather than seeking glory. The bridge connected not just riverbanks, but also the present to the future, creating pathways for armies that defeated tyranny and for civilian communities that built peaceful prosperity on the foundations of wartime innovation. Every vehicle that crossed a Bailey Bridge carried soldiers closer to victory or civilians closer to safety. And in those journeys lies the true measure of Donald Bailey's genius and the enduring power of engineering that serves human needs with reliability, simplicity, and grace. The story of how one portable bridge let tanks cross rivers in hours is ultimately a story about human ingenuity triumphing over seemingly impossible challenges, about the unglamorous work that makes victory possible, and about how the right idea at the right time can change the course of history in ways that echo through decades and shape the world we inhabit today.